I changed my title, I'm sorry, to this, using the example of trees. So I will rather have a quite theoretical approach to a media theory idea. What problems challenge us when we think about ecological images or media per se? Yeah, okay. So okay. It doesn't work. Normally you would see the numbers. Don't worry, it's not that important. So in the today's description of the conference, the organizers wrote that the slightest JPEG posted on a social network involves infrastructures and servers, of course. And we could also think that every Google search, this is Joanna Moll, an artwork which is already more than 10 years old, how Google emits how much CO2 it takes if you just click on any website. The 2023 film Barbie by Greta Gerwig shows a world made of pink plastic. And you can hear sentences in the film like, "There is no water in Barbie land," says Barbie, Margot Robbie, in one scene of the movie. And then they go on, "There is no water or fire, there are no elements." And Barbie is an ambivalent figure in two respects. On a symbolic level, the doll stands for highly problematic images of gender and race, and on a material level, she's the expression of a colorful world based on fossil materials like polyvinyl chloride, and I don't want to say all the words now, they are so complicated to pronounce, rigid vinyl, and chemical additives. Structurally, as with concepts of structural violence or discrimination, the symbolic material sides are, the symbolic and the material sides are inseparable. The exact environmental standards followed in the production of the film cannot be researched. I tried to, even though the film was awarded the Gold Seal of the Environmental Media Association. The environmental problem continues beyond the film with the consumption of new Barbies, even if Mattel produces the Barbie figure of environmental activist and behavioral scientist Jane Goodall from 75% of recycled plastic. Everything is connected to something. For decades, an ecological paradigm that focuses on relationships and systems has applied to many sciences. Since the 1970s, at the latest, this has been accompanied by an ecological imperative that calls for the basis of human life to be safeguarded. It was the philosopher Hans Jonas who theorized the concept of the ecological imperative in his 1979 publication, The Imperative of Responsibility. In this book, Jonas argued for an expanded ethics of responsibility that includes distant time and space horizons. Because the effects of human activity on planet Earth at the same time, at his time, this was nuclear threats, toxins, genetics, and the limits of nature, which seemed particularly urgent, demanded a new ethic due to their cumulative and irreversible extent, and that also considers, as he calls it, the horizon of the future. And the horizons of ecological responsibility must, as he says, correspond to those of action. More than 40 years after Jonas' publication, climate activists can still relate to the publication, which hasn't lost any of its actuality. And here you can see German activist Luisa Neubauer holding up the book during a protest 5 years ago in 2020. Different time period, actually, I think politically. The editorial of the new edition was written back then by Robert Habeck from the German Green Party, who also is a philosopher, long before he candidated for president. And I would like to actually scream and cry if I think about what happened to green politics since 2020 in Germany alone. Ecology as a paradigm of relational thinking and the ecological imperative as a moral principle have become inextricably intertwined since the ecological turn around 1970. At least two other texts should be mentioned because of their influence on the discourse. And now I show you two readings which you all know. The concept of ecosophy by Félix Guattari, formulated in the Three Ecologies in 1989. And by this he meant ethical political connections between the three ecological areas of the environment, social relations, and human subjectivity. And his aim was to make the ecological crisis comprehensible without simplifying it. He understood the ecological crisis as well as the social and psychological crisis as three dimensions of the same problem context. And this is still so important today. And Michel Serres, 5 years later, on the other hand, gave nature a subject status in his essay, The Natural Contract, which Bruno Latour consistently developed further. Both posed the important question of how the planet itself could become a political subject in the face of man-made natural disasters, so that it could speak on behalf of rivers or animals in a parliament of things. And recently, this approach has been increasingly pursued in legal philosophy. How such discourses interact in times of multiple ecological crises and have motivated new perspectives and subject areas for media studies research since the turn of the millennium is the topic of my talk. After all, media are also part of an ecological framework. With their utopian driving tendency, here I quote Hans Jonas, they have an eschatological potential, meaning the doomsday narrative, which is included into the risks and impacts of large-scale technologies, and this is even more evident in the 21st century than in Hans Jonas' times, I think. People in media societies today have to deal with a contradiction that on the one hand, there is technological and media technological optimism about solving problems, the techno fix, but also the artificial general intelligence will save humanity, of course, while at the same time, ecological decline is progressing due to the side effects of consequences of precisely these technology. And I think you all know that Microsoft just asked to bring into action again a nuclear power station to actually feed all these server farms to do these calculations. Since the late 1960s, ecology has begun to shape more and more disciplines as a meta-science of interrelationships. Since then, network thinking in the sense of relationality, cybernetics, system thinking, and feedback has shaped computer science as well as the life sciences, social sciences, psychology, and philosophy, to name just a few disciplines. The geological imperative, in turn, is directed towards human interaction with the biosphere, that is, with a living layer of the earth, which is the condition of human life. The wake word green in green game studies, as a field of research and media studies is now called, is aimed at this dimension of the concept of a green ecology, as I would call it to simplify it. Unlike a narrow concept of media ecology, which conceives the infrastructures and networking of media, be it telegraphy, television, or the internet, independently of their effects on the Earth's material cycles, an approach such as that of green game studies is based on the insight that media also depend on natural conditions of possibility. The motivation of these research perspectives is the realization, of course, of the ecological crisis. This existentially focused view of media is itself relational. As an extended history of networking, the approach explores the entanglements of materials and energies as they are consumed or metabolized by technical media in all phases. This perspective traces media cycles geographically and material geologically from the lithium or copper mines in China, the Democratic Republic of Congo, or Chile, via the data centers next to the Rhine here in Strasbourg, or high up in Norway to the dumps for electronic waste in Kenya, for example. And this new view is twofold. While one eye looks at the materialities, the other eye is directed at the level of symbolic orders. And now I'm talking about how to research and what comes into sight by this idea of the ecological imperative. So this view is twofold. meaning the representations of ecological crises or ideas of nature in the media. And this leads to the serious question whether every unrealized computer game, every unmade film would not actually be the most sustainable contribution to the topic. The imperative act in such a way that the effects of your actions are compatible with the permanence of real human life on Earth, this is Hans Jonas again, applies globally and locally. While the ecological paradigm is initially a neutral explanatory model of the world and thus concerns knowledge, the ecological imperative is aimed at political action, at political ecology. And it was actually part of the founding history of German media studies to keep political, ethical, and moral questions, when they are formulated in an activist way, out of the analysis. In other words, to say less what should be than what is. This is how I learned to do my research. But the boundaries between knowledge and politics are currently being questioned by many. And this is most evident when scientists, also some of my colleagues, join the scientist rebellion movement and the climate protest action. Cybernetics, infrastructures, and networks were and are consistent themes in classical media history, ranging from the postal system, telegraphy, and radio on the internet. In its early phase, media studies focused on the paradigm of ecology as a media ecology and descriptive category of cybernetic networks and infrastructures. Even if this research approach is repeatedly characterized by forgetfulness of materials, the Canadian cultural scientist Harold Innes had already consistently thought of infrastructures, materialities, and communication together. And Adrian at the round table already mentioned this, that at the same time the Toronto School made use of the term media ecology, and in a way it doesn't really help, I think, for what we are doing here, because in the Toronto School, which was then brought further by Neil Postman, ecological meant the central idea of an equilibrium or balance between human perception and the consumption of communication media. And by this, of course, there's this long line of criticism that too much television, too much TikTok will affect children's way to see the world, or it will even disconnect people from nature when using their smartphones to connect with the world. Two more images which can illustrate this. And this is a very typical criticism, of course, of the media since the beginning of the industrialization. In the following, I will explore the double view of media and interdisciplinary fields of research we can watch are brought up, which are currently being bundled under umbrella terms. And I just want to name a few of them, like the green game studies, the green film studies, infrastructure studies, the geology of media is also a big, broad theme, the blue humanities, which focus on water, the ice humanities, which focus on icy landscapes, the energy humanities, or the umbrella term environmental humanities, and combined with already existing approaches such as eco-criticism from literature studies. And I think it's really interesting to see all these fields evolve within the last 15 years, in parallel to the climate summits, actually, who also study ice and atmosphere and energy and blue things. Yeah. Anyone who deals with the ecological dimension of media from a media studies perspective looks at media with a symbolic aesthetic eye and a materialistic eye in this field. Similar to the tilted image of the famous rabbit duck head, I hope you all know it, these dimensions can neither be seen nor thought of simultaneously. So it's normally you have like, you talk about the movie and then you talk about the consumption behind this movie, and it's a flipping image for me. In perception, as in research, they remain separate, these two sides, although conditionally, as we all know, they are inextricably linked. Either I look at the way in which global warming or the extraction of materials in a computer game are thematized and narrated on a symbolic level on the screen, Or I thematize the consumption of energy and resources during gameplay, which usually goes unnoticed and takes place in the background. This double view was the starting point for the early text on media ecology and still divides the section of the Handbook of Eco-Media Studies, I highly recommend this handbook, into subchapters with titles such as eco-materiality, political ecology, eco-cultures, and eco-affects. The anthology by Nicole Starosielski and Janet Walker, which stimulated and brought together media-ecological perspective in a formative way, is also guided by the fundamental idea of consistently addressing the entanglements of media environments, of representations and the infrastructures on which they are based. Their first objective is, I quote, to expose the many ways that social and representational practices of media culture are necessarily caught up with media technologies, infrastructures, and ecologies, instead of assuming a split between the study of how films thematize environmental issues and the study of how media architectures impact the environment. We are interested in cultivating the connections that inhere between media about the environment and media in the environment. At the time, they were able to build on authors who already posed the question for film or how the themes of documentary films in their own non-sustainable production could be addressed in equal measure. And Adrian is with us today, he's one of them. The registers of this materialist turn in media theory are different, although the conditions of play and its symbolic worlds always remain materially bound and thus linked to planetary conditions. For the indissoluble connection between the symbolic media worlds and their planetary, that means physical and geological conditions, the generalized idea of a media theory derived from the elementary concept of media is valid. And based on a thought experiment that is often posed in communication and media studies seminars, when teachers ask what a world would look like without technical media, so we just get rid of all the, I don't know, the light bulbs and the microphones and the computers and the smartphones, so what would be left? The modification of this question for my talk would be to ask what a world would look like without eco-media, without elementary media. John Durham Peters described this connection as follows. The old idea that media are environments can be flipped. Environments are also media. Water, fire, sky, earth, and ether are elements, homely, sublime, dangerous, and wonderful, that sustain existence. Our very existence on a vast array of techniques for managing nature and culture, most of them ignored by recent communication theory due to their supposedly poor quality of meaning making. The fading out of the conditions of existence that Peters alludes to here is formulated in media theory with the idea of disruption and the transparency of media in smooth use without interference. And actually, when Julie was showing her performance, when she took the hammer to destroy the camera, this very much is this idea. So the basic idea is that the medium itself only becomes perceptible in the moment of disruption. And the mystic and philosopher Simone Weil put this idea down on paper in a universal form, I think, in the 1940s in her essay Gravity and Grace, writing, "We see either the dust on the window or the view beyond the window, but never the window itself. Cleaning off the dust only serves to make the view visible." Eyes, as I understand it, cannot focus on the glass, the material, and the landscape on the image at the same time. A comparable twofold order and tilt figure is also laid out in the interface theory of the double image. So we have this theory to describe screen images, interface images. And this theory distinguishes screen images into a top or upper side, so the symbolic order, which we can perceive aesthetically with our eyes, and a down or lower side, which we cannot perceive. What is visible on a computer screen is the perceptible upper side. What lies beyond the screen is the realm of the machine and the codes in an anesthetic underside. And behind this are further processes, of course, such as energy consumption, networking, and the material conditions of the hardware. Current media ecology research looks at the landscapes in the media on the one hand, and at the glass and everything behind it on the other. They look at the material conditions that are necessary for algorithms to be able to process at all. As with interface theory, ontological questions are also up for debate in media ecology. Media science, in the sense of a green media ecology, responds to the frequently voiced criticism of the dualism of nature and culture, but also of technology and nature. And with this idea, also Marshall McLuhan still stuck to the model of a second nature of man-based on writing or road networks when he wrote, quote, "The new media are not bridges between man and nature, they are nature." However, the criticism of dualism that has been increasingly voiced since the 1990s goes further than McLuhan's anthropocentric perspective. And so the media mixtures and transformations of culture and nature, as already considered early on in feminist theory as nature cultures, this is the term by Donna Haraway from 2003, are a key line of thought in media ecology. And we have more terms like this, like the nature/cultures by Bruno Latour, the techno-natures by Damien White, or the second nature idea. And Marie-Louise Angerer, my former colleague who sadly passed away last year, has used the term media nature to try to capture how she writes, quote, "Matter and technology as self-modifying practices are approaching each other in new ways." And fairly at the same time, Jussi Parikka proposed the term media natures, written a little bit differently, to describe the specific blending of nature and culture and the energies and materialities that characterize media. He writes, hence to talk of media nature, a term that is a useful neologism, is a way to try to grasp the intensive co-determination and co-emergence of the two spheres of natural dynamics and media cultural epistemologies, of the onto-epistemological situation that defines our technical modernity. Media are in and of nature in ways that expand any talk of the environment into a virtual ecology of social, political, ethical, and aesthetic dimensions. Media, like everything that people do culturally and like people themselves, are also nature. And now I will go a little bit quicker. We could also relate to the term cultural techniques and Bernhard Sieger's writings on this. And I will just quote the third quotation here on this slide. He wrote that media and nature, the symbolic and the real, are not distinguished in any categorical way. Instead, they form a type of ecology which operates beyond the nature-culture divide and the meta-form divide. And this is how I think the concepts are linked together. And I will now show one first example to illustrate this. In a lecture, computer game researcher Eduard Wilson discussed the experience of how game consoles automatically switch off during intensive gaming at high temperatures in summer. Gamers react to this by slowing down their game, so their gameplay, in order to prevent the graphic cards from overheating and thus unintentionally interrupting the game. On the other hand, gaming computers with powerful fans heat up rooms by several degrees with the waste heat from the processes, just like radiators. This example shows how the symbolic world of computer games is connected to climatic reality and points to an inseparable link on the scale of cloud gaming. And this is because gaming today is generally based on the computing power of remotely networked data centers, which in turn have to be cooled at great energy expense. So this is quite a climate atmospheric problem here. And as I see it, the perspectives that open up different fields for media ecological questions and that connect the symbolic levels with the material ones are at least 4. And I try to find some visuals for this with my friend who's an illustrator, Ruth Lorenz. she was doing them for me. So the first one would be the ecology of media, maybe the classic way to approach the topic in media studies as a cybernetic networking. So platform studies, for example, and telegraphy networks. The second would, as I see it, is the geology of media. That this is what I quoted Jussi Parikka for, which directs attention to the materiality of media. And then you would find yourself in talking about mining and materialities, but also the recycling problems and the dump holes. The third one is the term media environments, which in their entirety shape the perceived environments. So in a way, this would be the idea of the symbolic spaces we approach by talking about media as environments. And the fourth one is the idea of media of nature. And this would be media that shape the perceived environments, media of nature, like which bring nature into images, translate it into language, or make it tangible for people by means of measurements. Like the weather reports we heard about yesterday would be, I think, in this field. And now I have 3 examples, and I will really very briefly touch upon them. The example which was promised for this talk, and you can look into the book I recently published with Linda Allman, it's for the open access by Routledge. We looked at the platform, which is a global monitoring platform to monitor the tropical woods and to see forest loss and forest gain. So you would always find yourself on a Google engine, which is combining all the satellite data to measure forest gain and forest loss. And by this platform, there are a lot of feedback loops with the real world, which we described as cosmograms, and also a Google Gaia world, to actually make politics in the place. Like NGOs then can work with this data and make legal cases out of them. And this is like, they would go zoom into the ground and see, for example, on how illegal logging is taking place. The second example is from a very different genre, let's say. It's an advertising movie I found interesting for so many years now, which is telling us the myth of technical networking as an organic natural process by the German communication company Telekom, called Network of the Future. And I think we cannot stop to talk about the virtuality in which, like, the networks are told us, the fiber optic cables are told us, although everybody should know that it's like so much material in the ground already. Here you can see the people who bring them into the ground that actually make this network alive. And the final object is this object, which is a piece of a gutta percha cable, which was the submarine cable coverage for all the 19th century. And for this, and behind this cable, which here, of course, has this beautiful biosynthesis of organic and inorganic nature, it's like insulated, it's encapsulated in this shrine, a very erratic piece, I think. But in the background of this piece is a relational history, a histoire croisée, which is about unsustainable usage of trees, the gutta percha trees, and colonialism. So I come to my conclusion, which is called the negative dialectic of ecology. The dialectic of ecology is another form of negative dialectics, as Theodor Adorno saw it in socially and culturally mediated ideologies. And I see a future task for media studies in practicing the double and the dialectical view that is needed to describe media worlds in their complexity, interwoven character between symbolic and material orders. From an ecological perspective, it seems downright ignorant, or like a blindness of the mind and the denial of reality, if this is not done. Incidentally, this also does justice to media studies as a meta-science. So in Germany, when we discussed if we want to have a discipline called media studies, actually Friedrich Küttler suggested that it shouldn't be a discipline, it should be in all disciplines. And this is actually something media studies shares with ecology, I think. At the same time, it is important to remember that we also get up every day and live our everyday lives, even though we know that we could die at any time, and that is that we are already always living in dissonance and thus existentially not acting as we know we should. And finally, I want to show you some of the books I did on the topic. Many of them are also in English, and there's also one in France, which is on the topic of technical images. I brought one here, so if anybody wants it, I'm happy to give it to you. Yeah, merci beaucoup.